you promised me, you've never thought about this question. It's like a parlor game. Who is the greatest artist of the 20th century? I think everybody, 90% of the people, believe it's either Matisse or Picasso. You have...
We think it's Matisse-Picasso.
You think it's Matisse and you think it's Picasso.
Wouldn't it be an enormously...
Because...
No, not true. I will say this, that in the course of working on the exhibition, I think I started out a Picasso person. I don't think Picasso's come down a whit, but I feel I've gained a much greater respect for and understanding of Matisse.
And I think that is the conventional, that is the majority opinion of people who come here, that very thing. You gain an appreciation. Interesting point. You learn from putting an exhibition like this together. You, who've had this distinguished position at MoMA, and are well known as a curator, an historian, and a lecturer, come to new ideas and insights about Picasso, and especially Matisse. What did you learn about Matisse?
Well, one of the things is that an exhibition does things you can't do through books, you can't do through any other form of learning. When you bring two works of art into juxtaposition with each other, things that don't translate in reproductions, things that can't be learned by seeing one of them in Russia and the other one in Los Angeles, happen. And that's the joy of being a curator, that's the joy of coming to see an exhibition. That's why we go to all the trouble of doing it. And so after 5 years of working with this, when we stood on the floor and the works came in together, suddenly we saw cross-references we hadn't thought about before. We saw things in the pictures, the shape of an arm, the tilt of a head, the way that eyes were done, the power of a picture, its surface, the way it was finished or unfinished. These are things which you can only apprehend sensually in the presence of the originals. And that's why it was a thrill for both of us, even after 5 or 6 years of work and after seeing the show in 2 other places, to do the installation together and to talk to each other about all the new things, even in the course of the installation, that we discovered.
All right, let me raise a couple of questions about this. How they view different things and how they led a different life, which is sort of throughout this. Because, for example, Matisse always worked with a model most of the time, did he not?
Yep, he did. Yep.
Picasso...
Working from the imagination.
And mainly about his wives or his lovers.
Yeah, well, in general, he worked from the imagination and invented fictional characters, many of whom we now identify with specific people like his lovers.
Yeah. Color. Matisse was the best colorist.
He was, and he had instinctive gifts about color. One thing the exhibition demonstrates is there's a lot of great Matisses which aren't highly colored, and there's a lot of great Picassos which are highly colored.
One conventional wisdom that goes away, that you understood that they were each was better, that are different than your
Although I do think how they understand color is very different. And, you know, this is also one of the, one of the things which perhaps we knew but is confirmed.
How is it different?
I think that Picasso had a more nominative notion about color. He had an idea of colors as named things, which this is green, this is purple, this is pink. With Matisse, I don't think it was like this. I think that he started working on paintings and then invented the color combinations as they went along.
I think Picasso had symbolic associations with color, fairly traditional ones: blood, red, fertility, heat, orange for lust, for the idea. But he also, the colors of the Spanish flag. When he wanted to personalize things, he would impose the colors of the Spanish flag, the colors of a harlequin's costume with which he identified with himself. He often had superstitious or symbolic associations with things rather than simply the optical pleasure of seeing them mixed on the canvas.
How did they respectively view Cubism?
Well, I think that Picasso is clearly the inventor, along with Braque, of the style of Cubism. And when Matisse first saw it, he thought it was the most alien thing to everything he wanted to achieve. You have to realize that in 1989, what Matisse was pushing was a line of liberated color. And suddenly here are Picasso and Braque bleeding the color out of pictures, going back to a kind of monochrome brown. And Matisse wanted a kind of liberated, organic, splashy looseness. And here's a strict hierarchical geometry. He thought it was nothing he could ever deal with. But when Picasso and Braque began to move out of the dissolved, more atmospheric world of analytic cubism into a tectonics of line and isolated shape and flat panels in what's called synthetic cubism, say around 1912-13, then Matisse recognized a vocabulary of openness and a kind of open span iron architecture with simple bowl shapes that could lead him to new kinds of paintings. And then he wrestled with it and decided he was going to have to contend with it. It's interesting, I think, that he has a foothold in Picasso's work in the immediately proto-cubist works, that he sees something he can deal with in the kind of primitivizing works and in the works that come out in 1912. But there's a period in the middle where he not only is temperamentally alienated by cubism, he doesn't see anything in it he can use. Then when Picasso shifts styles, he says, I can use this, and then he begins to make it his own.
Surrealism. They had different ideas about surrealism.
They had very different ideas.
Picasso was a kind of
I mean, Picasso
founder.
was adopted by
Right.
the Surrealists, and the very aggressive mode of his paintings, particularly in terms of female representations, was something which the Surrealists could absolutely hang on to. And it was such a different world to, you know, Matisse's odalisques, his sort of make-believe harems and so on. And also, Matisse had this idea that Surrealism was about puns and thought it was too literary. And he was thinking, you know, less of Miro, whose work he liked, but more of Dali and Magritte, and artists of that kind. And he thought this was a throwback to old illustrative painting. And of course, it was only part of Surrealism. In the end, of course, Picasso produced this strange mixture of Surrealism and Matisse in the 1930s, and by doing this, he pushed a kind of colorful Matisseian style in a direction which Matisse could never have pushed it, and forced Matisse to sit up and pay attention. And I do think that what Matisse did in the later 30s, for me, unquestionably, is affected by Picasso, and therefore has a certain surrealist quotient in it, which could never have come in any other way. And I think, as often, we find not only that each artist is pushing the other, but neither would have been as great and as adventurous without the other.
You're shaking your head and nodding in agreement.
Absolutely. I mean, that's, I think, one of the great lessons is that each artist taught the other to be himself in some ways. The Demoiselle d'Avignon is a picture that was goaded by Matisse, but in directions Matisse would never have gone.
Did he see it? I don't remember the story.
He certainly saw it. Matisse saw it in the studio.
In the studio before Picasso completed it.
Yes, and Picasso didn't exhibit it until 1917. It was a kind of legend.
And in 1907 is when he painted it.
Yeah, and he was goaded by the blue nude, which he'd seen in the spring of 1907, and I think Matisse pushed him beyond the envelope of the Western tradition into tribal art in a more aggressive fashion. And then seeing the Demoiselle...
Wait,
and
Matisse pushed him?
Matisse pushed Picasso by his desire, by Picasso's desire to best the kind of roughness and savagery of the blue nude. He reached further than he might otherwise have reached for something even double savage and more aggressive and more transgressive than what Matisse had done. And when Matisse saw the Demoiselle, what it did was push him back deeper into the Western tradition, back to Giotto, back to the so-called Italian primitives, that he regrounded himself. If the blue nude is based on Michelangelo and the figures on the Medici tombs, the bathers with the turtle, which is his response to the Demoiselle, goes further back in Italian painting to Giotto. So that, in a sense, Matisse pushed Picasso in that direction, and Picasso pushed Matisse in this direction, and they became more themselves by virtue of the challenge with the other. And I think that's one of the more interesting things that you see happening throughout the show, is that happens, they polarize each other, and then sometimes, as John has outlined, Picasso will, for example, get a hold of Matisse's odalisques, do something with them that Matisse himself hasn't done, and force Matisse to remake his style, because Picasso has become more Matissean than Matisse.
There's a great quote from Picasso, who, after Matisse died, I think. What was it, John?
It was,
Matisse...
you know, he says that Matisse left me his odalisques as a legacy. And indeed, you know, right after Matisse's death, it's when Picasso begins this famous sequence of variations on Delacroix's work, which again is, you know, the work being mediated by another artist. But in terms of what Kurt was saying, you know, I think there's the other thing, which is the sensibility and the temperament. That Matisse was a slow developing artist. He wasn't naturally gifted. He was, in fact, rather clumsy as an artist.
And in fact, he got a late start. I
And he
mean, it was
got a
only
late
after he went to
start.
law school
Yeah.
and when he was in his
Yeah.
20s that he turned to art after he got sick.
Exactly. Picasso was a quick learn, he started quickly and was enormously gifted, a great virtuoso. And I think that Matisse helped Picasso to realize that virtuosity wasn't going to be enough in the 20th century. And Picasso taught Matisse that virtuosity could help. You know, and I think that in that sense, you know, it's a very interesting how they were working off of each other in that way as well.
Continuing this idea of both contrasting comparisons, how they were like and how they were different, how they influenced each other, Picasso was much more autobiographical.
Well, we tend to think that because what John said earlier, he made so much of himself as a celebrity artist. And for years now, people have tried to date his different periods by his different mistresses. And you have a feeling that his art fed off of his autobiography. But if you look at Matisse's work, if you look at the piano lesson, the Red Studio, his early paintings of his family, the amazing portrait of his wife, the later portraits of Lydia, the different models that he had, in some ways his work is quite autobiographical. It's just that he was so private about his life, that so little was known and he let so little out about it. He didn't want to be a public
social
figure.
Animal.
He wasn't a public. He was a social person with people he thought were important to himself, patrons, other artists that he liked, but he wasn't a public person in the way that Picasso knew how to play the media, he knew how to court writers, and the people who've written about him since have made a great deal out of the way he lived in public, and all of the famous breakup of his marriage with Olga and then the Marie-Therese incident. Well, in fact, the breakup of Matisse's marriage and the advent of new models is just as clear in his work. If you look at it, it's not as publicly known. Matisse was a much more private person. I think there's a lot that's deeply felt and autobiographical in Matisse's work that's not been recognized.
Do we get this here, or is this something we just know about?
I think it's something we're beginning to discover now with new, more probing investigations into Matisse's life.
Sex.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the interesting things in the show, and I'm sure John would say something about this as well, is the way that Matisse seems, in Matisse's art in general, he talked about his art being an art of consolation, being an art of repose for the mental worker. And there's certain territories he doesn't want to go into. So sex for him is often an issue of pleasure, an issue of lyricism, an issue of relaxation. Whereas sex often for Picasso is a moment of extreme tension, anxiety, aggression, rage, deformation, misogyny, etc. Very, very.
But what does that say about the two of them, both in personal terms and in artistic terms?
Well, Matisse had a certain kind of governor on his art. He had a set of limits where he didn't want his work to go. He believed it was the purpose of art to have a certain effect on the viewer. He wanted to transform the world. Remember Van Gogh talked about he wanted art to be consoling. Matisse had some sense that art did not want to be about deformation. It did not want to be about the ugly and twisted. It did not want to raise deep anxieties. And Picasso wanted his art to do these things.
Because he believed art should...
Partly,
John.
Also, he talks about wanting possession. He says drawing is a way of possessing the object. Matisse says drawing is a way of getting inside the model. And it's different. I mean, for Matisse, it was a sense of empathy that he wanted. And, in that sense, he identifying himself with the model means somehow that the model's otherness sexually, in a sense, is effaced by this because the model and Matisse have become one person. With Picasso, the model is always another person who should be seen to be separate and to be seen to be possessed. I mean, it's a very different kind of thing. And it's complicated, of course, when one thinks of how this